we'll collect those at the end of the Sunday school class, and then I'll go home and look at what you guys said. What we want to do is to review a little bit from last week, and then we'll start.
Okay, we ended last week with this quote by Francis Bacon. A little science estranges a man from God. A lot of science brings him back.
So what we're going to argue today is that there is a lot of science being done by secular scientists that will absolutely bring us back to God. And it's fascinating because they are motivated not by proving God, but in fact the opposite. But their science is in fact telling us exactly what we know to be true, and that God is present and has always been present and will continue to be present. So, reviewing scientism, which is really important, particularly as we kind of talk about some scientific views on how the universe began, is this idea of scientism. And it claims that science alone can render truth about the world and reality. All right, so there is no room in scientism for God, and that's their foundational idea. Second is historical science. So if we're looking into the past and trying to explain something that has not been observed, that's what historical science is. And what they try to do is to look at, okay, how do things work now? And maybe they apply to the past, so that we can get a sense about how it happened. There are a lot of assumptions related to historical science, and honestly, it probably shouldn't be called science at all. And finally, 3 interpretations of observation. So when we look at something, does it look like it's just pure chance? It just came about. There's nothing, there's no order. Or is there a law that governed that action? Or as we look at it, is there a designer? Is it so complex or so original or so unique that there must be a designer? Again, you look at a book and you know that didn't come by chance, and there's no law governing the words that created that book. So the idea of origin of the universe, there's a lot to it and a lot more than I understand. I'm not an astrophysicist, but I thought the way that we would do it is to look at it chronologically. What did we think? How did it begin? And what are some changes in the ideas related to the origin of the universe? So let's begin in the beginning.
Genesis 1 through 5. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters.
2 really important things that come out of that beginning is, one, that this came about out of nothing. It was spoken into existence by God. So that is fundamental to our belief that the universe began as a spoken word from God. Second of all, the order of things is also critical, particularly as we talk about the Big Bang Theory coming down the road. And that is, the earth and the heavens and the waters were on day 1. And that will be important as we look at, again, the Big Bang in a little bit.
Okay, Genesis 1:16 through 19. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars.
Day 4, sun, the moon, and the stars came about. And remembering again that this came after the earth was formed. That chronology is critical.
Okay, then Genesis 1:27 says, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them.
And I put that in not because it's fundamental to our understanding of the origin of the universe, but it takes us back to the entire theme of what we're trying to do in these 8 weeks or so, and that is to understand that as created beings, in God's image, we have a unique purpose and a plan, and have that to offer to the world that is really suffering right now. So we continue to speak to the importance of that.
Aristotle believed the Earth was the center of the solar system, and the sun and planets revolved around the Earth in circular orbits.
So as we move through this chronology, we have our account, the Christian account of how this happened. Aristotle, who the Greeks were big on sort of looking at stuff and making sense of it. So he reasoned that the orbits of the planets around the Earth were circular because most things in nature were circular. He also reasoned that men have more teeth than women because their jaws are bigger. Now, last week we talked about science and experimental science. It would have been very easy for him to call in 1,000 men and 1,000 women and count their teeth, and then determine that his idea was wrong. But that was not the Greek way necessarily. They reasoned, and what's important and why we start with Aristotle is that his emphasis on the scientific community was significant. Ptolemy then carried this idea of the Earth being the center of the solar system and the planets and the sun revolving around it, and also carried forth this idea that the universe was eternal. The Catholic Church adopted this as orthodoxy, not necessarily completely to their fault of bowing to scientific ideas, because there was some scripture that supported this idea, at least in their mind.
Okay, in Psalms 104:5 says, "He sets the earth on its foundation, it can never be moved."
This verse and others was sort of the foundation of the idea that the Bible stated that the earth was the center of the solar system and things revolved around it. You all know or have heard of Copernicus. He had a rather primitive telescope, looked out into the skies and said, "I don't think that's right. I think actually that the earth and planets revolve around the sun." And so he put forth this idea. He was a Polish astronomer who died in 1543. Now, Galileo, who was an Italian astronomer and a devout Catholic, looked at those ideas from Copernicus and said, "Yeah, I think you're right." The problem is that he was going against Catholic orthodoxy, and that he ultimately had to recant his ideas or lose his faith or his life, and that's debated, but there was some concerns he had for his life as a result of going against Catholic orthodoxy.
Okay, alongside the idea of the Earth being the center of the solar system was the idea that the matter and the universe were eternal. This has persisted until modern time.
And if you think about it, if you are trying to explain or deal with the idea of matter in its origin, making it eternal really helps you out, if that makes sense. You don't have to explain where it came from, you just said it was always there. Now, Edwin Hubble, who the Hubble telescope was named after, lived in 1889 to 1953. In 1925, through his telescope, looked out into the stars and noticed something. And he said, the light coming from the stars are shifted into the red wavelength. And what that means is that they're moving away. So he then reasoned that if the stars are moving away, if we go back in time to the very beginning, they had to all begin at one spot. Because if they're moving away, they had to have a beginning. Interestingly, Einstein, who obviously is brilliant, created his theory of general relativity. And he also thought that probably his formula for general relativity suggested that the universe had a beginning. But he was so opposed to the idea that he actually put in a constant in his equation to make the universe static. So he denied initially his theory because he philosophically was opposed to the idea that the universe had an origin. It wasn't until, and there's a very famous picture of him looking through Hubble's telescope and admitting, in fact, that he was wrong. And he considers that the biggest blunder of his life, having altered his original equation to answer his philosophical bias.
Fred Hoyle was an English astronomer from 1915 to 2001, and he coined the term Big Bang Theory, but it was really just in passing, and he didn't believe it, but it caught on.
Yeah, I mean, he just said, oh, it must have just been then a Big Bang, and everyone now has heard of the term Big Bang, even though he mentioned it in passing. Okay, so there was 21 of you who said the Big Bang Theory contradicts the Bible, and 8 who did not. All right, the 21 of you who said it contradicts the Bible are wrong and right. All right, and we'll talk about what that means, because the Big Bang Theory really in its origin, in its beginning, said that yes, the universe had a start. And if you were in the first service, Shane put it as good as I've ever heard it, and I hope I wrote it down right. He says, the Big Bang is simply the echo of the Word of God that spoke the universe into existence. That's marvelous. And in its fundamentals, that's what the Big Bang Theory is. It means that the universe had an origin. Now, the problem with the Big Bang Theory is that the people who then went on to explain it couldn't be settled with the idea that God spoke it into existence, of course. So they reason, first of all, they're able to tell what are the elements that are in a sun, and they're basically hydrogen and helium. Now, the Earth has a bunch of elements, and anything heavier than hydrogen, helium, and lithium are considered heavy elements. So how do you explain the origin of heavy elements if, in fact, we know that they're here? They rely on the idea that stars have these elements, they explode, make new elements, the stars that are next to them gobble up those elements, do some stuff in the star, explode again, and before you know it, you have all the elements necessary for the Earth. And so it takes about 3 generations of stars to do that. Interestingly, as we look out into the universe, there are no 3-generation stars. Now, going back to Genesis 1, the Earth was formed before the stars. So there is no way that the Big Bang, in its naturalistic explanation, can in fact explain how the universe came about, because Earth, with all of its elements and perfectly formed, occurred before the stars. So there's where we depart from the Big Bang Theory. And there's many areas where we depart, but that's the big one. So it does contradict the Bible, and at the same time, it speaks to the fact that it has an origin, and God spoke it into existence.
Okay, so the first dilemma is, if the Big Bang Theory is true, how do we explain who or what was present in the moment before that singular event?
So we don't have to struggle with that question, because we know the answer to the question, and that is God spoke it into existence. But if you are not part of the theistic community, the Christian theistic community, then you have to come up with ideas. So Carl Sagan said, matter is universal with oscillating universes. Now, what he means by that is that the universe expands, cools, contracts, expands again, cools and contracts, and keeps expanding and contracting. That was rejected almost as quickly as it was offered, because we lose useful energy as we move along, the second law of thermodynamics. So it's just not possible. But he had to come up with something. They're grappling with this question and having to come up with an answer. Astronomer Robert Jaslow said he wasn't sure if the agent of creation is the God of the Old Testament or one of the familiar forces of physics. So he even, a non-Christian astronomer, offered the idea that maybe there is a creative being, the God of the Old Testament.
And Stephen Hawking said the early universe existed in imaginary time. No need for a creator because there's such a law as gravity, so the universe will continue to create itself out of nothing. It's called scientism, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. The early universe existed in imaginary time. So you don't need a creator because there is a law, such as gravity, and the universe will continue to create itself out of nothing.
My granddaughter says, what? And I think that this deserves a what, don't you? And there's going to be a few more what's coming up. All right, so Stephen Hawking, absolutely brilliant. I mean, I watched a documentary on him, and the math that came out of that brain is absolutely incredible. And it just covers walls of space, explaining the ideas that come out of this incredibly creative mind.
Okay, then philosopher Quentin Smith says, the universe came from nothing, by nothing, for nothing. Yeah.
Thank you. Exactly. All right, then there's this fancy word called participatory anthropic principle. I practiced that in front of the mirror this morning. The universe, get this one, the universe did not fully exist until human beings emerged to observe it. The universe decided to evolve human consciousness. Nobel Prize winner George Wald, the universe is a quasi-intelligent being that can know and be known, that can plot and plan. Actually, we would agree with that. It's just God. But he didn't mention God. So the universe is a quasi-intelligent being. I mean, these are people who are brilliant, who have been awarded the Nobel Prize, and this is what they're coming up with for the origin of the universe. And the reason that we do this is not necessarily to make fun of them, but to say the most brilliant minds in the world are struggling with this idea of how did this come about? Well, yeah, that's for later on. All right. Lawrence Krauss, who is a very famous American theoretical physicist, said he redefines nothing because, again, ex nihilo, the universe was created out of nothing. So let's talk about what nothing means. Because he redefines nothing. Because something is physical, nothing must be physical, especially if you define it as the absence of something. Okay. Yeah. Exactly. Talking yourself in, okay. So let's talk about some good stuff.
Okay, so the second dilemma is the really exquisite fine-tuning of the universe for life.
So Shane mentioned this last week, and this is again coming out of secular science, and that is if you look at the things that exist in our universe that we can see and define and measure and repeatedly measure, things like the strength of the gravitational force, the mass of the atomic particles, the speed of light, the strength of the magnetic force, all of those are exquisite. And the margin of error is almost zero. So the idea that we are here and existing, I don't know if this is a good example, but if you buy a goldfish in the store and you bring it home and plop it into a pan of boiling water, your results aren't going to be very good. But if you bring that goldfish home and you have an aquarium that is perfect, the pH of it is right, and there's the proper food, and the temperature is right, and the size of it is good, then that fish will live. It's the exact same thing here, and that is humans exist, the universe exists in this very perfect, narrow margin of laws.
But the probability of this occurring is nearly zero. So these things were done before the universe was formed, therefore it had to come from someone outside the universe.
So, once again, secular science recognizes this. This is true. There's no argument about the fine-tuning of the universe. So what do you do if, in fact, you do not want to attribute this to a being that exists outside of the universe, the God of the Old Testament? Then what you do is you say, okay, there's a bunch of universes out there. It's got to be. So there's just this multiverse idea. The problem is that if the possibility is nearly zero in this universe, it's nearly zero in the next universe and the next universe. And so this idea does not work. And so it just really needs to be abandoned, but they don't have another explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe right now.
Okay, Fred Hoyle, again an atheist, British astronomer, said, "A common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology."
He's not a Christian. He is a well-known astronomer, astrophysicist in the UK who has simply looked at this and said, it's just not possible. He also is not, again, not a theist, and also does not believe in evolution. We're going to talk about origin of life next week. So this is what he says, removing all biases and just saying, man, this looks like it was created. This is design. This is not chance. This is not a law governing it. This is design. Okay, how many of you have heard of the James Webb Telescope? Couple? All right. I really, 60 Minutes, I don't know, a few months ago, had a special on the James Webb Telescope. So it was 25 years in the making, $30 billion. One of the most incredible feats of engineering you can imagine. I mean, it was so well done, so perfectly packed in this rocket that sent it 900,000 miles away. And interestingly, because the temperature 900,000 miles away is different than the temperature on Earth, they actually had to make it bigger so that when it opened up, it shrank into perfect position. So it is really incredible. And that speaks to the fact that God has created men and women who are really smart and really technically excellent, even if they're not believers. So good stuff. And I hope I have not suggested at all during these last 2 weeks that non-Christian scientists can't do good work. They do excellent work all the time, and we benefit from their excellent work. And this is a good example of that. Now, the Hubble telescope looks at just light that comes in, but the James Webb telescope looks at infrared wavelength, and the atmosphere filters infrared wavelengths. So they had to send it way away. And they did, and it was launched on December 25th, 2021. It then started taking in data the following spring, I believe it was. And when they turned it on, all they saw was snow. Does that make sense? The old TVs, if it wasn't tuned in very well, you just got artifact, basically. So when they looked at that artifact, they thought, oh, no, all this time and all this effort that we put into it, we're not going to get anything out of it. Until they realized that it wasn't an artifact at all, that they were looking at 1 trillion galaxies. And so they were just absolutely astounded by the idea that this universe that we have, which is called space, interestingly, it's called space because they thought there wasn't much there, when in fact it is absolutely full of galaxies. And in each galaxy, there are billions of stars. You can do the math about how many billions of stars, quadrillions of stars are out there. All right, so some of the other things they found is there was a Christian astronomer who wrote a paper before it was launched and said, this is what we're going to see. And one of the things that he said we're going to see are young galaxies. Now, if we go back to the original idea of the Big Bang, and galaxies are fully formed and have all of the major elements, all the heavy elements that we were talking about, you would not think that at the edges of the galaxy, edges of the universe, there would be fully mature galaxies. Because it takes a while, and so it only ought to be stars at the end. When in fact, one of the major finds of the Hubble, or of the James Webb Telescope was in fact young galaxies at the edge of our universe. So there is absolutely no explanation for that. So the Big Bang Theory now is having lots of troubles, as any theory you might expect would have if in fact it departs from Scripture. In the 60 Minutes show where they were talking about the James Webb Telescope, the non-Christian astronomer said, the universe is more beautiful and more populated than imagined. And then he says, we understand 4% of the universe. If we understand 4% of something, we probably should be humble in our explanations of its origin or how it works.
Okay, Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands.
Job 9 and 10. He is the maker of the Bear and the Orion, the Pleiades and the constellations of the south. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted. John Lennox, who is an Oxford mathematician, said, to some of the comments that we read earlier, the what comments, he said, nonsense remains nonsense even if high-powered people say it. So we left some time at the end here for questions and comments. So questions, comments? Any astrophysicists out there that want to say, you got that wrong? Yeah. Yeah. Sloan is not here, so we'll repeat your.
Want me to take it?
Yeah, you want to take that? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Bob, we got to have you on the microphone.
My personal understanding, whatever theory, whatever wisdom man has, that doesn't start with God, then that has to start someplace else with him or God's enemy. Those intelligent wisdoms, in any argument, the foundation thought is very important to the direction of it. Godlessness as the foundation cannot take you into perfect truth because it doesn't have that as the foundation. We need the right foundation, a truth foundation, if we're going to follow a principle. Otherwise, we end up in tragedy.
Yeah, for sure. And again, wonderful things come from secular science, but secular philosophy or sort of conclusions from their science that are non-biblical will have troubles.
I was just thinking, if people didn't recognize Jesus as God and he's right before them, and that's the condition of their heart, their minds are darkened, their heart is darkened against God, that will, and it goes along with what you're saying, it'll guide your thoughts and your study and your perspective. And if they couldn't see God right in front of them, like, we should be humble too, because our thinking can be flawed, and we should be checking our heart and submitting to God, and not just criticizing scientists, because I'm sure they're brilliant, and
Yeah,
we are flawed too. It's just trusting God. Anyway.
Great. Back.
I was just thinking, as a grandparent and a parent, that if our kids do not have a good biblical basis before they go to a secular high school, grade school, college, whatever, they are going to really be taken in by these people. And it doesn't take but even a year to train their minds to go against God if they're not really grounded. So I just, knowing what's going on in the high schools and the colleges, parents and grandparents, it's so important our kids know the biblical basis for what they're going to understand about the worldview.
There's nothing more powerful than the celebrity culture, and there are no more powerful celebrities than those people teaching our kids and grandkids, for sure.
So I'll speak to that a little bit. Can I give a brief personal testimony?
Absolutely.
So when I was growing up, I went to church. My family went to church. I went through the motions, learned about God and his love. And I really wanted to believe in God. I really did, with a childlike faith, but I couldn't, because in school I learned about the Big Bang and life evolved, and basically there is no God, right? Science proved there is no God. That's
right.
So that's where I was. And so then, when I was 20 years old, it was in college. I was doing a 6-month work assignment in Florida. I had some Christian friends, and they sort of introduced me to the idea of creation. And took me to a bookstore. I got some books on it, and for the first time, I learned, creation. Not only was a viable theory, but it actually made more sense than evolution. And it wasn't long after that I gave my life to Christ. It was October 31st, 1992. My roommate said it was a big kick in Satan's butt to get saved on his day.
Good point.
But it goes to the important, this is a subject we need to teach. I mean, that was the roadblock for me, and you take that roadblock away, and I was ready to accept Christ.
Yeah.
And
I mean, this is sort of an unusual topic to do what we're doing, but it is, in fact, doing what it did to you,
and unfortunately, a lot of churches won't touch it, which is sad. How are we going to reach these young people if they're told over and over in the schools, life evolved, millions and millions of years. And then we're supposed to, tell them believe in God. How can they believe in God when they have this mindset that God can't be real?
They're certainly not being taught the dilemmas that are occurring in the secular worldviews. They're being taught that this is in fact true. The science is settled. We know the answer.
Yeah, they never covered the dilemmas in public schools.
Absolutely.
They just said, "Oh, this is it." So.
Right. And as you've seen, the smartest people we know have no answer, and we can feel comfortable because we do have the answer, and approach them with, okay, tell me how matter started. I know how matter started. God made it happen. But in your mind, help me with that. Help me to understand how you think this all started. What was the origin of it? Anyone else? Right. Mike at the back.
The Bible says God created. Do we really need anything more? And it's hard for us to put our feeble minds around things like eternity. And where does space end? Where do the galaxies end? What's beyond? If there is an end, where is it? Folks, it's just, you've got to trust God's word. Place your faith there and live in peace. I don't need all of these, you call them very smart men. I call them sometimes educated idiots. And just live in peace. Trust God.
We do need to expose influencers. Influencers.
Just want to make this confident statement. God never created anybody he can't talk to. How did he talk to me? I got bit by a spider, a recluse.
Oh.
And all of a sudden, I'm ready to listen to God. And God has ways to get people's attention. The hard thing is there's 1,000 voices out there talking. Christians, we are God's ambassadors to this world. Let us not adopt the godless conversations.
Very good, Bob. Matt? Getting your steps.
I find it interesting that these brilliant scientists keep putting their own personal opinions and beliefs into something that should be totally fact-based and not, that should be facts, not subjective. And it's weird because I do think that these people are amazing and smart, and smarter than probably everyone in this room. No offense. But the fact is, I have seen so many people that act like they can prove or disprove God when in reality it would be, with our understanding of the universe right now, is we can't, because we're limited by our 3 dimensions. We're limited by so much space travel, math, so many variables that to really prove it, to really disprove it, you would need to be God.
I think on that point, there's no unbiased, like they think that they're unbiased in their presentation of fact, but no person everybody has bias. Even if you look at like a car accident, 2 people that observe the same event will have different tellings because we all have, anyway, so science is the same way.
Absolutely.
So yesterday I tried to use the NFL to make a point, and it didn't go over well. So for Mike, I'm going to use a baseball one today. So sometimes we view these things like a baseball field. Imagine yourself being pushed out into the batter's box in a Major League Baseball game. It'd be very uncomfortable because we know what's going to come our way, and we're going to have no chance of hitting it. So we need to remember that the weapons that we fight with are not carnal. It's not based on our skills and our intellectual abilities to win this. Because if we do view it that way, we're going to shy away from it. And some of us are sitting here going, man, I can't even play this game. Okay? It's not a game, and we just need to remember that we are equipped with the truth, and that's what's going to set people free.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the foundational idea is just because it comes from science doesn't make it so. And we know what is so. And so if we come from the foundation that the Bible is true, every bit of it, and that is our foundation, when science comes up with something, we can look at it through the biblical eye, not having science explain the Bible to us, but having us look critically at the science and say, this isn't science, this is scientism. And we know that you are biased, inherently biased, and you're clinging to your atheism. And we're just going to ask a few questions. You don't have to be an astrophysicist. Ask a few questions that will say, just tell me how you feel. Tell me what you think. How did this come about? Because I'm struggling with it from your perspective.
Maybe you said it, I didn't hear it, but the reference that the Big Bang is accurate because God spoke and therefore something happened. My understanding of the Big Bang was that somehow matter somehow came together and collided to create a Big Bang, but where did the matter come from to create the Big Bang?
Exactly. So you're right and wrong. Yeah, you're right. The Big Bang is we like the Big Bang in the sense that it means that matter was not eternal, and that was very disruptive to the scientific community. We do not like the Big Bang in the idea that somehow natural forces did it. We know better than that. So, in general, we reject the Big Bang. But I really do like what it did to the scientific community and had them come to the idea that it came out of nothing. And we know it came out of nothing. So in that respect, we're right along with it. All right, thank you all. Next week, we're going to talk about origin of life. You think this was fun? Wait till we get next week.